Alright, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So, inshallah, today we're going to be continuing our tafsir with Surah Al-An'am, but I thought we would actually put these two, side by side in order for us to kind of see where we're at. Okay, so yesterday we did قُلْ أَرَأَيْتَكُمْ إِنْ أَتَاكُمْ عَذَابُ اللَّهِ بَغْتَةً أَوْ جَهْرَةً هَلْ يُهْلَكُ إِلَّا الْقَوْمُ الظَّالِمُونَ. And we also did وَمَا نُرْسِلُ الْمُرْسَلِينَ إِلَّا مُبَشِّرِينَ وَمُنذِرِينَ فَمَنْ آمَنَ وَأَصْلَحَ فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. We actually did this ayah a couple times and did even those set of ayat a couple times. So وَالَّذِينَ كَذَّبُوا بِآيَاتِنَا. That's where we left off at. So let's see with these ayat وَالَّذِينَ وَأَنذِرْ بِهِ وَالَّذِينَ يَخَافُونَ أَن يُحْشَرُوا. So we also did this one. قل لا أقول لكم عندي خزائن الله ولا أعلم الغيب ولا أقول لكم إني ملك إن أتبع إلا ما يوحى إلي قل هل يستوي الأعمى والبصير أفلا تتفكرون. And certainly, when we speak about قُلْ لَا أَقُلْ لَكُمْ عِنْدِي خَزَائِنُ اللَّهِ, we yesterday talked about the inference here, and we said that the disbelievers, when they heard the Prophet ﷺ say that whoever believes, and he would guarantee them certainly security and certainly piety if that was there. If faith and piety were there, then he would guarantee them basically security. In other words, no fear and no sorrow. But then they started questioning, how is it that you're going to be guaranteeing this when you don't even have yourself all the different things that involve probably prosperity, maybe wealth, maybe security yourself. Here you are, you're persecuted, etc. So that's when that ayat was responding to such a question. And of course, the questions in the ayat may not always tell us what they had questioned, but then the ayat would lay out the responses. Now, this is important to keep in mind. So that's why sometimes you might see like this ayah, and then you might say, well, okay, why did it actually give me a response to something? So then that leaves it to you, to assume and know what the question was. I'm giving you the response, and right away, you're going to know what that question was, or at least what the objection from the disbelievers was, and here's the response to it. So why didn't it say the objection? It didn't say the objection because their objection was not worth mentioning, but it was worth to respond and to give the response to it. So the ayah would give you the response for you to know that I recognized what some of those might object to and how they might object to what I had said. Here's the response without needing to even mention what their objection was. Without needing to mention the objection, going to get you the response, and here's the response. Tell them that you don't have the control, whether the powers of Allah Almighty or whether the keys to controlling the different things, whether matter or whether we're speaking about motion or whether we're talking about how things function. You don't control that, and neither do you control the different dimensions in time. So when you look at al-ghaib is mainly related to time. Al-khaza'in is related to matter. Just keep that one in place, okay? When we're speaking about khaza'in, we're speaking about matter, we're speaking about property, we're speaking about the control of things, samawat, ard, etc. And also we're speaking about qudra, we're speaking about power. So when we speak about power, we're speaking about how things function, we're speaking about motion, we're speaking about energy. So this is khaza'inullah. Okay, These are all khaza'in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when we're speaking about the other dimension, which is time, whether what happens in the past or whether what will happen in the future, that basically is al-ghaib, and that's also controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's important to see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us those different areas of what controls the world together and what puts everything together. So whether we're speaking about the different things, the samawat, al-ard, the plants, the different creations, the different creatures, that would be in khaza'in Allah. How they function, the rizq, uh, the different rizq that is needed for their existence, etc. That's going to be khaza'in Allah. Whether we're speaking about life, the life expectancy, whether we're speaking about uh, offsprings, we're speaking about probably how big, how small something is, all those different details, shifa, marad, etc. And all of those different things, they're basically in khaza'in Allah. But in terms of time, if we're speaking about different things about history, what happened in history, how to change things in history, how to change what's going to happen in the future, all these different things to avoid basically possibly things in the future. Okay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, well, letting those that are basically challenging the prophets know that the prophets do not control these dimensions within the creation, within the world, whether we're speaking about matter, we're speaking about the energy that makes it function, or whether we're speaking about time, whether in history or whether in the future, whether we're speaking about the purpose, the end of purpose, in other words, the result, all of that, that's in the control of the Lord Almighty. So just keep that one in mind. We're speaking about time, we're speaking about matter, we're speaking about energy. All of that is controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَا أَقُولُ إِنِّي مَلَكٌ. وَلَا أَقُولُ إِنِّي مَلَكٌ. When we're speaking about وَلَا أَقُولُ إِنِّي مَلَكٌ, that's basically to respond to what they had thought that a malak, or in other words, that they have a direct assistance or direct relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, that they would have at least some power, not necessarily full divine power, but at least some power from the Lord Almighty. So the response was telling them that these prophets and messengers don't control Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's areas of control, neither do these prophets and messengers have access to what even the angels control. Even if they might have done a miracle here and there, that simply does not mean that they have any power. I would also like to respond to another thing. Speaking about this one, there are some Sufi groups, this is not at all to generalize, but there are some Sufi groups that had mentioned and had considered that al-awliya are at a higher level than al-anbiya. What does that mean? What is a wali and what is a nabi? A nabi is a prophet given the message, the wahi from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through Jibreel alayhi salam to the rest of the people. Okay, that's a nabi. Al-wali is basically a person that had invested in amana wa aslaha, invested in being faithful, in being a person of religious integrity, and this person basically lived in a certain relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But some mystical groups, awliya, or sorry, Sufi groups, they had considered that the wali has a certain direct relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore they misinterpreted the ayah, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيَعْلِمْكُمُ اللَّهُ. They said, well, if they have the taqwa, then they will have a direct ilm from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore leaving out the link, which is Jibreel alayhi salam, because they would have a direct knowledge from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, this is Gnosticism. Gnosticism is thinking that a person will have a direct knowledge through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, giving them some inspirations, and these inspirations would make this person holy, and therefore they would have access to probably knowing about your past or knowing what you had done while you were away, which is what they call kashf, and or perhaps the teacher will have certain relationship with the murid where they could even control, and then they would basically have what they would call Majboob, basically having certain powers where they could even have miracles to control things around them, etc. So this in itself contains a lot of shirk within it, because if we are to think that a person can have a direct knowledge with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then later this direct knowledge can give them even the power. Now keep this one in mind. Some of the mystical groups had used this prelude and considered that if this person has a direct knowledge from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then their statements may override even sunnah. Keep that one in mind. This is right there. This is kufr. If you are to say that anybody's statement overrides the sunnah, or anybody's words, dreams, whatever it is to override a prophet's words, this is right there on the spot kufr. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, "Al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum wa raditu lakum al-Islam dina." Islam is basically the complete deen. To think that any prophet or any wali can override Islam or certain statements in Islam, that's kufr on the spot. That's number one. Number two, believing in this had actually resulted in a lot of the mystical groups slash the many Sufi groups, to connecting with the awliya and not connecting with the prophets themselves, with the prophet himself. So you would see a special focus on, for example, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani and what he had said, or probably al-Wali Badawi and what he had said, or probably come to perhaps the maqam al-Sitti Zainab or maqam al-Sitti Nafisa or whatever it is, going to those maqamat, thinking that they would have the power to perhaps maybe give them cure, or probably give them ilm, or probably give them success, or probably give them rizq, etc., and forgotten Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because they would think that this is where the power can connect us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, now this comes with the same idea that you would see whether the pagan Arab, they use the same idea, they use the same philosophy to say, well, we don't want to go in tawaf around the Kaaba because of our sins. So they would undress, basically do tawaf naked, because they would give themselves the narrative that we had committed sin in such garments, so we would like to take it off in order to really reveal the reality of ourselves, and to go around the Kaaba basically with no garment of sin, when in reality they're just committing a sin right there. So Shaitan would create certain narratives to confuse them in how to relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they would think that I'm going to this wali, or in Palestini, where the older ladies would call them willi, not wali. Okay, and they would consider whether it's al-Wali Badawi or al-Wali, probably different names out there, or Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, etc. They'll connect with those names and consider that they would have the power to, one, give me the rizq, because they would connect directly with Allah, and they would have the power to even change some of the things about us, whether we're speaking about in the different matter, or whether we're speaking about different energy, such as the energy possibly of rizq, or possibly cure, or possibly just different things, or even changing the past or the future of things. So it's another form of shirk, but it's given a halal label. It's exactly if you were to look at perhaps Hindus or any other pagan religion, that's the same idea. The same idea in pagan religions. Pagan religions do not consider that Allah doesn't exist. Pagan religions consider that God exists, but these, whether people or whether certain beings or creatures, that they would have the direct relationship with God, and therefore they would basically have a certain power to work on ground and work in God's power on ground. Okay. And I wanted to mention that one because this is plain shirk. And in Al-Aqidah Tahawi, it does actually emphasize this piece of it, that no wali is beyond the prophet or any messenger, and that the prophets and messengers are the ones that are infallible. It doesn't mean there aren't any awliya, but in order for us to know who a wali really is, we would not know a wali until they're dead. Wait, why until they're dead? We can anticipate wallahu hasibuhu while a person is living, that this person seems like a person that might be a wali. We could see possibly their deen, their faith, certainly their commitment, their religious integrity. We can probably think of them as awliya. We could see that, but we would not really guarantee that they're awliya till, or we don't want to say guarantee, maybe. We wouldn't know, at least to a certain level of guarantee, let's say it that way, because on Judgment Day, that's the true guarantee. Okay. Not in this dunya, but we wouldn't really say that this person is a wali until we would see their ending and that they had actually died on faith. Because we could have a person live faith and فيما يبدو للناس, as in the hadith, as to what appears to people, but then all of that might change later on. All of that might change later on, as in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, إن أحدكم لا يعمل بعمل أهل الجنة حتى ما يكون بينه وبينها إلا ذراع فيسبق عليه الكتاب فيعمل بعمل أهل النار فيدخلها. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. That one would do the actions of Ahl al-Jannah throughout their life. It isn't until the very ending that they would basically flip and everything about them will flip. Subhanallah, and I had seen that many, many, many times. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those that would be committed in their deen from their early teenage up until their old age. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us a long life with Iman, with Salah, with piety, with commitment, and Husn al-Khatimah. That's the dua that we would all make. With Husn al-Khatimah. Husn al-Khatimah is important to determine the person's ending. Okay, let's continue right there. In attabi'u illa ma yuha ilay, that's also with the same idea, that if it's a wali or if it's any salih person, what they're supposed to be following is basically what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed onto them, not what they somehow had invented some kind of an inspiration. The prophets and the messengers, inspiration, or at least what we would use the word as inspiration, but it's wahi in a different sense of inspiration. That's basically is exclusive to the prophets and messengers, and therefore no one would have type of let's call it privilege that a prophet and a messenger would have. No matter how hard they worked, no matter how hard they worked in their iman, They would never get the privilege or the powers or even the authority to legislate as a prophet and a messenger would have. That's it. That was at the end of it. قل هل يستوي الأعمى والبصير أفلا تتفكرون. Certainly, you could see there are a number of different ayat, whether it's هل يستوي الأعمى والبصير, هل يستوي الذين يعقلون والذين لا يعقلون, هل يستوي, and the list goes on and on with giving us those comparisons that they're not equal. And certainly when the ayat would say they're not equal, that's basically to take us into realizing that just as the beginning is not equal, in other words, they're not equal in the whether we're speaking about the potentials or they're not equal in what they probably would live their life. In other words, the implication in this dunya, neither are they going to be equal in the hereafter. Neither are they going to be equal in the hereafter. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling us that a person that is blinded from using their potentials to seeing truth is not equal to a person that is capable of using their potentials to see the truth about their existence, to see the truth about the definition of justice, about the different definitions of life, and certainly how they're going to implement that definition into making it something that brings in the right outcome on Judgment Day. So when you see the word أَفَلَا تَتَفَكَّرُونَ, that's basically to tell us there is a paradigm that basically controls the world around us. This paradigm that you would see in this dunya, how the right, let's say the right ingredients, whether the ingredients in what brings in the potentials in place, what brings in the results, and certainly finally the final results on Judgment Day is basically controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in other words, seeing that just as it's not the same, the outcome is not the same with a person that is seeing than the person that is blind, or a person that is capable of thinking and a person that's not capable of thinking, or an ignorant person, educated person, or a person that is probably obedient and a person that's not obedient. They're not the same. Therefore, and in the end, it's also not going to be the same in the outcome, certainly because the beginning was not the same. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that it's not going to be the same if a person is committed to faith and a person that's not committed to faith, just as there cannot be complete equity between the two variants, then that's the same thing in speaking about the results. If there cannot be full equity between two variants, if things are different, then you cannot necessarily say that the results don't matter. If the beginning of things and you recognize they're two different things, then therefore you recognize that the result is different, then you must recognize that the person that lived in a certain commitment is not going to have the same result that for a person that didn't live the commitment in the hereafter. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that just as you recognize the variables and things, then do recognize that outcome in the long run is the same that you would recognize in this life. They're not similar. They cannot be treated in the same way. The potentials, the implications, the different relationships and all of those different things, they would lead to different outcomes. Well, that's the same thing. On Judgment Day, a person living in faith, a person living in integrity is not going to have the same outcome as a person that had chosen to not live in religious integrity, to not live in faith, and so forth. Okay? وَأَنذِرْ بِهِ الَّذِينَ يُخَافُونَ. Therefore, since we recognize that they don't have the same conclusion, they don't lead to the same result, and therefore of course, the beginning is going to determine the ending right there. And certainly, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, from that statement, أنذر به الذين يخافون أن يحشروا. So what you need to do, أنذر به, then warn with what? With the Quran. Warn with what? With it, letting them know. Now, bringing anzir bihi, this pronoun bihi right there, in other words, warn with it. With what? Whether with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent in the Quran, or whether with the statements that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically informed them about. But who is really going to be making use of this warn? الَّذِينَ يَخَافُونَ أَن يُحْشَرُوا. Who's going to be making of that? Well, it's basically those that would fear to be resurrected and certainly joined on Judgment Day to their Lord Almighty. لَيْسَ لَهُم مِّن دُونِهِ وَلِيٌّ وَلَا شَفِيعٌ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ. When they would have no authority, no support outside of the Lord Almighty. So when you look at dunihi, outside of him, who is him, that's basically the nearest noun, and that's rabbihim. They would have no authority. So when you look at wali, you're talking about authority, you're talking about decision, you're talking about power, you're talking about support. That's the wali. They would have none of that outside of the Lord Almighty. وَلَا شَفِيعٌ. A shafi'ah is an intercessor. Why is it talking about a shafi'ah right there as an intercessor? لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ. So two things. Number one is because the ayah before it, you look at this one, this ayah is actually coming from right here. قُل لَا أَقُولُ لَكُمْ عِنْدِي خَزَائِنُ اللَّهِ وَلَا أَعْلَمُ الْغَيْبَ وَلَا أَقُولُ لَكُمْ إِنِّي مَلَكٌ. This ayah is actually coming from a certain cultural or a certain, let's call it cultural belief that they would have, that the disbelievers, the pagan Arab at least, they had a certain idea, they had a certain culture, or at least faith, that they thought that a certain intercessor, whether it's an idol or whether it's a person, which they would consider basically not a monk per se, but it would be a kehen, so kind of like a certain priest, okay? And this priest that they considered has a direct relationship with God, and therefore they controlled how different things would function. They controlled how the future would unfold, or probably had a direct relationship with those that are in direct relationship with God, and that would be Shafi'ah. That would be the intercessor. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting them know that, well, if you were to think, since you had understood that a prophet doesn't have these powers, it's only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, well, now you would know that even on Judgment Day, this isn't just in dunya, but this is also on Judgment Day. No one is going to have the power outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no authority, there's no power, there's no support outside of Allah. Neither is there anybody that is a shafi' unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills, and unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala approves anybody's shafa'ah. Whether we know that on Judgment Day there are certain approved intercessions. such as the intercession of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, such as the intercession of certain salihin, the intercession of shuhada, the intercession of someone that memorized the Quran, the intercession of basically certain chosen people for Siddiqeen, etc. Those they would be given certain, let's call it, approved intercessions. But wala shafi'in here in this comprehensive statement is basically generally saying that no one is to intercede outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why min dunihi, so outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's approved shafa'ah, approved support, there would be none by outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is to continue the response. Now here's the thing. It said لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ, for possibly they might actually find taqwa. What is that taking us into? Two things. Number one, when you look at لَعَلَّهُمْ, the word لَعَلَّ is taraji. Is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what does taraji mean? So harfu tarajjan actually means that this is in hope of something. So does that mean that this is in hope, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is being hopeful? No, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically give them that raja. Remember when we talked about dua al-mas'ala and dua al-ibadah? So this is possibly if they lived in al-khawf min al-hashr, if they lived in fear of Judgment Day, they feared the day when everyone is gathered, when everyone is resurrected. If they truly feared that, then that is what is possibly going. Here's that possibly. Where did I get the possibly? From the la'allahum. La'allahum is to basically tell us that what would, let's say, what would induce religious integrity is a certain other feeling, which is يخافون أن يحشروا, is to fear that day when they would be resurrected. Just keep that one in mind. In other words, there are certain feelings that if you were to provoke, that they would basically bring in a certain outcome of action. Let's do it again. If you are to provoke certain feelings, that's how you would provoke a certain outcome of action. If you are afraid of probably getting diabetes or probably heart problems, etc., then you will put in an outcome of action, possibly working out, possibly eating right, probably, doing all the different things that basically avoid, or would probably, you would anticipate that, oh, I'm afraid of getting into such a result, so I would basically put in a certain work of action. And that's the same thing. Even on Judgment Day, a certain sentiment might actually provoke a certain work of action. So that's why when you look at mawa'idh, keep that one in mind. What is il-mawa'idh? Il-mawa'idh, people, long time ago, maybe I would say 30 years ago, 20, well, yeah, 30 more, 20 years ago, the situation was different, but 30 years ago, there was, 30 and 40 and 50 years ago, there was a lot of emphasis on al-maw'idha. And what is al-maw'idha? Al-maw'idha, a scholar in the masajid, the scholars in the masajid, and even in women's groups, there would be a woman that's not necessarily a scholar, okay, not necessarily a scholar, but they would call her wa'idha. What is a wa'idha or al-wa'idh? They're not necessarily scholars, but they would be in different groups. They would be at different times in the masajid. They would hold a certain halaqah just to remind them about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to remind them about Judgment Day, to remind them to live their religious integrity, to remind them about taqwa, etc. And those mawa'idh, they would definitely be a lot more a lot more in within the community than the classes of fiqh, than the classes of probably aqidah, etc. And their presence was always keeping people's religious integrity alive. And this needs to be revived within our society. They don't have to be scholars, but they're just there to remind people to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The difference between al-wa'id and a person that studied fiqh, a person that studied aqidah, a person, they actually studied, let's call it the academics. Just because this person studied in the academics, it doesn't necessarily make them good at wa'id. Okay, just keep that one in mind. There are certain people that are so good at wa'id, they're very limited possibly in their ilm, but they know how to speak with to people's hearts in reminding them of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I would say probably the most important figure, at least in the Arabi world, was a Sheikh Kishk. A Sheikh Kishk, he was, maybe I could bring you his picture for a second, right? Let's actually do that and just see a Sheikh Kishk. Want you, it's really worth mentioning a Sheikh Kishk. And a Sheikh Kishk, like you could see, he was a blind man, an Egyptian blind man. The ilm that he had wasn't this magnificent ilm. In fact, many times he would quote a hadith that are even fabricated. But he had the most powerful lectures. His voice was something that had influenced many because he had despite his disability and being blind, but he basically had the voice, he had the courage to stand and speak out against all the different, let's call them spiritual illnesses within the society. And whether we're speaking about political illnesses, political powers, and those that would try to do da'wah, those that would try to remind people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And certainly was really referring to al-Ikhwan because he himself was actually part of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Ikhwan. But he really did an outstanding job. And it's quite sad that he wasn't actually given the appreciation and certainly the respect that he really had deserved, despite his disability. He managed to have this word of maw'idha really touch the hearts of millions. And I mean millions. The second I would hear is Sheikh Kishk, and he would say, Man il Malik, and people are responding, Allah. You could see this aqidah being taught by a Sheikh Kishk, and it was really one of the, I would say and claim that one of the most important figures that affected the Egyptian society was actually Sheikh Kishk. The Egyptian society, by the way, similar to the Moroccan society in many ways, also the Syrian society, is that the presence in let's call it uh, the religious notes, the spiritual notes, the influence of the mysticism, not mystical, but in well, Sufism is mystical, but the influence of that maw'idha is always there. So you would see whether it's al-wali being present or whether it's al-wa'idha coming into the women's homes, giving a maw'idha, or probably when a person dies, or probably they bought a house, they'll bring somebody to make the dua in the house. They'll probably have a certain relationship with the scholar. They'll call him Maulana, for example. It's completely different than other societies that had really lost this connection. And sorry, Palestinians, I would say that we lost this connection. Yes, we tried to revive it in different ways in politics, etc. But I think we missed out on al-wa'adhin and al-wa'adat being present in our life. And that's one sad thing that I must say. Sorry, Palestinians. I know you're doing and working hard in facing the occupation, but I think one, as a Palestinian, I think it's fair for me to say a certain illness is that we sometimes have the audacity to to give our own fatwa and say, hey, khudha minni, and then they'll basically give their own fatwa and have the audacity to claim a certain fatwa, to step outside of their positions and actually act as the wali, act as the maulana, act as the scholars, act as those people, and not giving the appreciation for those scholars. And I remember when I wanted to study Sharia, the society around me, they were the ones to discourage me from studying Sharia and said, I remember one friend of ours, when she heard that I was going to study Sharia, she right away said, "Oh, رجعنا للتصوف." That's what she said. So we're going back to becoming Sufi. You could just hear the different cassette tapes that at the time it was cassette tapes, different cassettes, and learn your Islam through that. Why don't you, since you're an A student, why don't you go and study medicine? It would basically give you a better future, better outcome, etc. But then, subhanAllah, you could see it wasn't just her, it was many, many, many within our family, within my family, within the society that basically had discouraged me or attempted to discourage me from studying Islam because they considered that that's going to lead me into extremism and nothing but extremism. But if you were to look at, for example, in other societies, memorizing the Quran, for example, you look at the Somali society. Memorizing the Quran is considered that before you would even go to school, you're supposed to be memorizing the Quran. Before you would get anywhere, Quranic memorization is supposed to be key before you do anything, before you go to school, before you talk about any education, before you talk about any job that you might get. No, no, no. You're supposed to be going to the Duksi, memorizing the Quran, etc. And that's the same thing you would look at in the Syrian society as well. There was this, no, you're supposed to go to the Katatib. You're supposed to go to the الكتاتيب, basically those teachers in the masajid. Those were the figures that had a special connection. And I must say, Sufi groups had a great influence in making those mawa'idh or those wa'adhin present in the lives of the society. Those wa'adhin were usually Sufi. They were usually the Sufi teachers. They were usually the Sufi students, and they would come in different occasions or sometimes on consistent times. Every Wednesday, we will have a halaqah in this masjid or in this house, or we would do this in such as same thing with al-Qubaysiyat. They basically come from those Sufi groups. The influence is really the same, or probably الطريقة النقشبندية or الطريقة الشاذلية or الطريقة, in those different tariqas, they had those connections at least with trying to induce الخوف من الله سبحانه وتعالى, fear in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in order to produce التقوى, in order to produce religious commitment. Was everybody necessarily living the religious commitment? No, of course not. But I would say it was basically bringing in a society that had better religious outcome meaning better integrity. And certainly when you would ask any Egyptian about Sheikh Kishk, especially the older generation. You would ask them about Sheikh Kishk as an example. They would always have no, I guess, no criticism whatsoever, but his great influence in reminding them of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And just the voice, Man al-Malik, Allah, Man al-Qadir, Allah, Man al-Raziq, Allah. And you would hear it. And even though the information that he's giving is really simple, it's really simple information, but his ability to convey the message, it makes you shake. It makes you shake. It makes you tremble. You would have no power but to feel your body is going into goosebumps. That's it. Goosebumps. He would be carried. He would be carried while he's making this maw'idha, and they would be carrying him to prison, but he would continue. He would continue, does not care. Does not care about imprisonment, about cells, about all those different tortures that he might be facing. He will live this taqwa and give this maw'idha. So having that being said, in practice, how do we induce this maw'idha within ourselves? We would have to keep this, let's call it this revival of fear in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, fear in Judgment Day, fear in hellfire. All of that is not necessarily just an information. Attend halaqas that would do these mawa'idh, even if you might be more knowledgeable. Because it's not about the knowledge, not always about the knowledge. Sometimes it's the reminder. It's the connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's the connection that would induce the feeling of al-khawf min Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of al-khawf of transgressing the limits, of al-khawf of al-mahshar, of al-khawf of not being part of a-salihin. And that's what's going to bring in لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ. That's the same thing with the children. With the children as well, when you raise them, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would reward you. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would punish you if you were to do this. So it's living bayn al-khawfi wal-raja. And certainly this is positive khawf. There's negative fear and there's positive fear. This is positive fear because it's going to lead us to discipline. This is going to lead us to discipline in this dunya in order to get to al-akhirah. So parenting is supposed to contain both, and same thing when we're speaking about discipline. In the masajid, we don't always have to have these ulama. We may have al-wa'adhin. But it's very important to let al-wa'adhin know their limits. They cannot give fatawa because their limit is basically within maw'idha. Okay? Well, their limit is within maw'idha. They are to remind people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're to remind people to seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to seek basically doing what is good, etc. لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ. Now, when you look at لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ, what else do we learn from that? And why لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ? This reminds us of the ayah before that. Remember this one, لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَضَرَّعُونَ? There it is again. When you look at لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَضَرَّعُونَ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may reduce. And remember when we talked about some of the Sufi groups, remember when we talked about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may reduce certain privileges, basically to test the people in order to induce in them التضرع, to induce in them that worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the same thing. reducing certain privileges, reducing certain things in dunya brings in at least this mas'ala, this closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeking Allah. Same thing with here, لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ, inducing certain feelings of fear in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether fear in Judgment Day. How can I induce fear in Judgment Day? Number one is taking the time to learn about Judgment Day. But I already had taken those classes in Islamic Studies 101 classes. Yes, you had probably taken those classes, and I know you know. But doing those classes over and over and over again is helpful to bring in the reminder. So even if you had known the information, put in this reminder, this time to remind you. Yes, listen to the dars over and over and over again, the same dars. It's okay because it reminds you. And listen to a dars, even if it's somebody that's probably less in knowledge, probably than you, because that's to bring in a reminder. Sometimes you attend the classes not necessarily because you are seeking to know, but sometimes it's to seek to get the reminder of something. And this is extremely important, to also have that humility, be humble and listen and have that ilm, even from those that basically have less ilm than you. Let's continue right there. لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ, for that might actually induce in them التقوى. And we talked about التقوى. التقوى is basically religious integrity. التقوى is to have deep love for the sake of the Lord Almighty. And that deep love for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically induce within the person that fear in losing that love from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or losing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's love. وَلَا تَطْرُدِ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ مَا عَلَيْكَ مِنْ حِسَابِهِمْ مِنْ شَيْءٍ وَمَا مِنْ حِسَابِكَ عَلَيْهِمْ مِنْ شَيْءٍ فَتَطْرُدَهُمْ فَتَكُونَ مِنَ الظَّالِمِينَ. So what happens here? By the way, no, let me go back to the previous ayah. Let's see right there, al-Qurtubi. He said, الَّذِينَ يَخَافُونَ أَن يُحْشَرُوا. There is a debate, by the way, that I did not mention, that scholars in regards to this ayah, before I jump to this ayah, وَأَنذَرْ بِهِ الَّذِينَ يَخَافُونَ أَن يُحْشَرُوا. Is this talking about, when it says أَنذَرْ بِهِ, warn those that would fear, basically resurrected on Judgment Day and being in those places of al-hashr on Judgment Day, basically on Yawm al-Qiyamah, is this necessarily anzir bihi, to warn? Is this talking about the disbelievers here, or is this talking about the believers, or is this talking about both? Okay, so that's basically that debate, but the preponderant is that yakhafun, to mean that they would know, that they would fear, and certainly if it's a Muslim, you would give them that warning in order to leave sin. And if it was of somebody probably from Ahlul Kitab, you would warn them of Judgment Day in order to probably let them search for truth, follow what is true, and certainly, of course, if it's the mu'mineen, it would basically remind them how to stay steadfast on truth and stay steadfast on haqq, and stay steadfast on their commitment to the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you say أَنذَرْ بِهِ الَّذِينَ يَخَافُونَ أَن يُحْشَرُوا, يَخَافُونَ أَن يُحْشَرُوا, so who is it referring to? So whether it's referring to the believers that basically would be warned in order to stay committed, the ones that commit sin in order to leave sin and go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or whether it's the Ahlul Kitab to go back to the truth and basically tell them and remind them to go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or whether we're speaking about or whether we're speaking about the pagan as well, in order to let them recognize that there's something that will be inevitable to happen on Judgment Day, and they should be prepared for it. Okay, so okay, let's see. Then we continue. Let's see, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, with the shafa'a. Here are some of the ayat that al-Qurtubi wanted to note, that when it says wala shafi'in, that certainly this is a comprehensive statement, but that is to be understood in the line of the other ayat that basically had said وَلَا يَشْفَعُونَ إِلَّا لِمَنِ ارْتَضَى. All right. And وَلَا تَنْفَعُ الشَّفَاعَةُ عِنْدَهُ إِلَّا لِمَنْ أَذِنَ لَهُ من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه لعلهم يتقون. Okay. So in other ayat, whether it's in Anbiya ayat 28, Saba ayat 23, Al-Baqarah ayat 25, 255, all of those are basically considering that there is an exception to this at least generalized statement, that there is no intercession, but if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would approve, would accept their shafa'ah, would approve their shafa'ah, and again would approve their shafa'ah in Surah Al-Baqarah. So this generalized statement is not to be taken out of context, because you have other ayat that would give me a clearer context in how we would understand that ayah. Okay, وَلَا تَطْرُدِ الَّذِينَ يدعون ربهم بالغداة والعشي يريدون وجهه. It's actually one of my favorite ayat, by the way. It's very similar to the ayah in Surah Al-Kahf. We're going to get there, inshallah. And do not turn away, or is it kick out, those that would worship, or is it to invoke their Lord Almighty throughout the day and throughout the night, and what they seek is the face of their Lord Almighty. You have no ability to hold them accountable. Well, is it really that? Or is it that he would not be capable of making that judgment? وَمَا مِنْ حِسَابِكَ عَلَيْهِمْ مِنْ شَيْءٍ فَتَطْرُدَهُمْ. And you would not be capable of turning them away and be amongst the zalimin, and be amongst the oppressors. Wait a minute, so who is being kicked out here? Why are they being kicked out? Are they really being kicked out? And who's this ayah really directed at? Let's see right there. There's a story. In order to understand this ayah, the story behind this ayah is that the disbelievers, they were telling the Prophet ﷺ, we would not want to sit with these people, that is the poor Sahaba. What do you mean by the poor Sahaba? So we're talking about the Sahaba that were basically known to being at least let's call them the lower class, at least in economy. Okay, they were basically lower class. So the upper class disbelievers, they were coming in at times and sit and just listen, but then they said, we don't want to sit with them. In other words, it's embarrassing for us to basically sit with these lower class groups, whether they were talking about or referring to Salman al-Farisi, who was an ex-slave, okay, and Suhaib al-Rumi, also an ex-slave, Bilal, also an ex-slave, Khabbab, also an ex-slave. So they considered that, these people have a history of being slaves. We don't want to be considered as being part of their group, because we're an upper class. We're honorable. We're basically a different level. So if we would like to come in, make sure these people are not part of our group. In other words, give us some form of honor and some form of exception and some form of segregation between us and them, because if you were to include them with us, it basically somehow affects our honor and our social status. Okay, now just an idea. Salman al-Farisi, he was a Persian who we know the story of Salman al-Farisi. He wanted to basically seek the true religion, and then finally, after becoming, well, basically first a Christian monk, and then later on basically goes and ends up in a slave trade by some Jewish groups and Jewish rabbis. They basically scammed him and ended up basically selling him as a slave. Found himself then in a scam of slavery, and then ends up being a slave. And Suhaib al-Rumi was actually kidnapped from Iraq, and then kidnapped from Iraq, but is then sold as a slave to the Byzantine Empire. Umar ibn al-Khattab would often make comments about how he's Arab but not Arab, because he was kidnapped from Iraq, so he was obviously Arab, but then the Rum had, I guess, altered his tongue, meaning his language. His Arabi was not as fluent as the rest. Bilal ibn Rabah, he was part Arab, part Ethiopian, but certainly because he was the son of a slave woman, Hamama, that was enough to exclude him and basically consider him as an outcast. So we know the story of Bilal ibn Rabah. Khabbab ibn al-Arat, what we know, we don't know much about his history, but we would know about Khabbab ibn al-Arat basically being a blacksmith. And when he was a blacksmith, he was his female master would always torture him because he had become Muslim. Would use these heated rods, metal rods, and put it on his skin. And then he would go crying to the Prophet ﷺ that he couldn't handle the torture. That's when the Prophet ﷺ kept on saying, making the dua, Allahumma ansur Khabbaban. Ya Allah, give victory to Khabbab. And then Khabbab later on, his female master, gets severe migraines. And then she was told about this homeopath medicine, and that her way of getting cured is to heat metal rods and basically put it on her head. So she, out of the severe migraines that she was getting, she was asking Khabbab to do the job. Khabbab to heat the metal rods and basically put it over her heads. And of course, it was upon her request and upon the direction of some who knows homeopath medicine that they basically had suggested at that time that that was going to cure her severe migraines. And that's when basically and what results in her death. Who knows what kind of a, I guess, infection she got as a result of her homeopath medicine. Okay, so what the disbelievers had asked, that these basically Sahaba, that they would be kicked out, and then the Prophet ﷺ, hamma, what is hamma? Attempted. Did the Prophet ﷺ actually kick them out? No, but he had attempted to somehow at least give them, for now, just to allow those disbelievers basically come in and have a space to possibly attract them to Islam. Probably, if that was at least this social segregation, or this social inclusion was distracting, or basically let's say repelling the disbelievers away from hearing the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ attempted to segregate those Sahaba away. So he called Ali ibn Abi Talib to basically write to them a certain note, not to the Sahaba, but then the poor Sahaba, they basically decided, well, we'll just sit on a side. That's when the ayah was revealed. That's when the ayah was revealed and considered in basically considered that no, this was not an acceptable attempt, was not an acceptable action to segregate the poor Sahaba from the rich Sahaba. That's why Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, or Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, is it, or Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas? I can't remember which one of the two Sahaba in the hadith that is authentic. And he said, فوقع في نفس رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ما شاء الله أن يقع. Then the Prophet ﷺ, there are certain things that he probably wanted to attempt to fall for their request, but that's when certainly the ayah was revealed. The Prophet ﷺ, why did he attempt to do that? He attempted to do that because he was really wanting to give a chance and thought maybe if I would give them the space to get closer, maybe that would draw them to the religion of Islam. But then, and that his companions, the poor companions, they recognize the arrogance that these people are living in, etc. But then the ayah was really clear in its statement. And here it is, I guess it explained to me it was Sa'd ibn Abu Waqqas in that other hadith. It was very clear. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, there you go, was mentioning it right there. It was mentioning it in this hadith right there. That Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, he said, كنا مع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ستة نفر. We were six. He said, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas was not poor, by the way. Okay, he was actually considered amongst the upper class, well, middle class, more middle class. Okay, he said we were with the Prophet ﷺ in a group of six. And then the disbelievers, they came to the Prophet ﷺ and they said, kick those away because we don't want them. لا يجترئون علينا. What is لا يجترئون علينا? It's because they considered, yeah, we don't want them feeling that they are at the same level as us. And in other words, we don't want them to somehow transgress their limits with us. They have to recognize that they're poor. They have to recognize they're ex-slaves, and they have to recognize that we're at a different class, basically. So Sa'd ibn Waqqas said, وَكُنْتُ أَنَا وابن مسعود ورجل من هذيل وبلال ورجلان لست أسميهما. So this narration, Sahih Muslim, Sa'd ibn Waqqas said it was myself, that is Sa'd ibn Waqqas, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was also not necessarily an ex-slave, but he was doing the job of slaves because he was poor, so he was even doing the work of a shepherd. So he was basically considered, similar to really that very low class. رجل من هذيل. Well, Ibn Mas'ud was part of قبيلة Bani Hudayl anyways, so possibly another person that he didn't really name, he didn't know who it was, and he said Bilal ibn Rabah, so possibly the names that we had mentioned here, but this narration doesn't really mention who exactly. And he said, رجلان لست أسميهما. It doesn't mean he doesn't want to name them, because there was no fear that if they were to be named. But he was saying, well, I can't remember who the other two guys were, but the Prophet ﷺ had attempted to basically segregate the poor Sahaba from the rich Sahaba, or from the rich, basically disbelievers, in order to give them a chance. That's when this ayah was revealed. Now, here's the thing. When it says وَلَا تَطْرُدِ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ, I want to emphasize on the word يَدْعُون. Does the word يَدْعُون meaning يَعْبُدُون, or is the word يَدْعُون meaning that they would be literally making dua, in making an invocation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Why is that even important? Because certainly the ayah is giving an honor to those that would do something throughout the day and throughout the night. So whether it is yad'un to mean that they would be consistent with their daily salah, or whether it was yad'un to meaning that they would be invoking their Lord Almighty throughout the night and throughout the day, meaning participating in dhikr. أذكار المساء, أذكار الصباح, etc., or even reading Quran. Okay, so all of that was basically praising what they were doing and certainly emphasizing that it was something throughout the day and throughout the night, and it wasn't on occasions. It was something that they were consistent in doing. Yuriduna wajha, what they were seeking. In other words, the ayah is emphasizing that they had complete sincerity in their worship, in their actions, in certainly in their commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they were not doing it for anyone else. So therefore, when you look at the face, why the face? There's a thing in Lughah Arabiya, it's called al-Badal. And there's al-Badal al-Ishtimal, there's al-Badal when it's referring to something as partial, but it really is referring to the whole of something. Okay, so when it says yuriduna wajha, to not only mean the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but this is to mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself is basically seeing them, is basically hearing them, etc. So in other words, this is relating to that they're considering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore wajh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why in the ayah, وَيَبَقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ, and the face of your Lord Almighty is what basically remains. And in another ayah, وَالَّذِينَ صَبَرُوا ابْتِغَاءَ وَجْهِ رَبِّهِمْ, and those that had lived the commitment in patience, seeking the face of their Lord Almighty. So why the face itself? When you speak about the face, you're speaking in Lughah Arabiya, you would usually be speaking about the whole. You would be speaking about basically the whole person. When you speak about your face, for example, you're speaking about your identity. Okay? In other words, you yourself. When you're speaking about ما عليك من حسابهم من شيء, that of course actually, before we jump into that one, let's look at this ayah right there. And in Surah Al-Kahf, ayah 28, the same quote, واصبر نفسك. Yeah, they should be in that. Okay. واصبر نفسك مع الذين يدعون ربهم بالغداة والعشي يريدون وجهه ولا تعد عيناك عنهم. The same, or at least the same part of the ayah. واصبر نفسك مع الذين يدعون ربهم بالغداة والعشي. Similar. This one is ولا تطرد الذين يدعون ربهم. This one واصبر نفسك. What's the difference? This one is be patient with those that يدعون ربهم. Those that would be يدعون ربهم بالغداة والعشي. يريدون وجهه. Same quote. ولا تعد عيناك عنهم, and don't turn your eyes away from them. This is also not meaning only the eyes, but this is al-badal, to mean don't redirect your vision. In other words, with the salihin, with those that are seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you definitely want to surround yourself with them. Even so, this is not only to the Prophet ﷺ. We know that there's a context for this ayah. We just talked about the context. But later on, العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. What is that? العبرة, the thinking, is basically in the generalization in the statement and not necessarily in the context that it was revealed in. So what is that telling us? Embracing a salihin and being patient with the salihin. Sometimes a salihin might sometimes be hard to live around. Listen to this one. Sometimes the salihin might be hard to live around because their expectation, their standards are high, and your standards might be lower. So when their standards are higher, sometimes you need to put in the patience, endure a certain amount of pain, because their expectations are higher, so they're probably, hey, I need you to do this, you need to do this, etc. So when their expectations are high, you need to recognize that there's an amount of sabr. They're probably, oh, you need to memorize the Quran. I need you to do your adhkar. I need you to do your classes, this and that. I need you to consider hygiene. I need you to consider probably a certain akhlaq, a certain commitment, a certain relationship with your parents, etc. All of these different things. That's basically the standard. The higher the standard, the more that you probably need to put in a certain level, a certain amount of sabr, because their standards are higher. And when you look at this one, that العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب, living around the Salihin certainly comes at a price. And that price is their standards are probably higher than your standards. So you basically have to live a certain amount of commitment, a certain amount of endurance, a certain amount of patience, stay longer in silence, because they don't handle a large amount of maybe joking around, or probably doing a lot of the humor, and probably doing a lot of those different entertainment, etc. They can't handle a lot of that, because their own nafs is constantly living in al-khawf min Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Once you put them outside of the corner that their hearts are living in, then they're going to start going away from you. So if you want to grow in your لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ, you want to grow in your taqwa, you got to endure a certain amount. وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ. You're going to have to endure a certain amount of patience. That's when they would become the teachers, to teach you how to elevate your own standards, the standard of how many times of dhikr are you doing? How commitment are you to your salah? How commitment are you with your hijab? How commitment are you with probably keeping boundaries between you probably and non-mahrams? How committed are you to probably maybe being committed to your faith, to your deen, in all those different areas? How committed are you to learning your Islam, etc.? That's going to require a certain amount. وَلَا تَعْدُ عَيْنَاكَ عَنْهُمْ. In the beginning, you might feel at least uh, you know compelled to, I just don't want to see, this is too hard, it's too much. It's basically, and they'll use, and shaitan will use different narratives to tell you that that's too extreme, that's too harsh, etc. That once you feel that those salihin, you're seeing that shaitan is telling you that these people are too harsh, these people are too do all these different things, then you want to be careful, because it could be the shaitan trying to keep you away from the salihin in order not to be a part of them. So you want to be really careful in how you relate with the salihin, how and where, in what environment you put yourself in. So there are certain people that certainly, the salihin, the ulama, you want to teach yourself how to be silent, how to be patient, how to be around them. Just by surrounding them is a barakah. Just by surrounding these salihin, it's a barakah on its own, because there's an inspiration that you would learn from them when they're committed to their dhikr, when they're committed to their salah. We are an average person. They're going to be praying their prayer, and that's basically, oh, I'm finished with my salah. And they're basically leave. But the salihin, no, I'm going to take more time. I'm going to spend more time. The dhikr, you might be annoyed with the amount of possibly, they even if you were to go on their phone, for example, it's always either the reels on dhikr, the reels on probably excerpts of a lecture here and there, that etc. All of these, and you're like, oh, this is boring. Let's go for something funner. Let's go for something entertaining, etc. You want to be patient with those in order to elevate your standard. You want to elevate your standard. You want to reach the point where they would be, just like they are enjoying it. You want to enjoy it too. It's going to take some time. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling the Prophet ﷺ, وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُم بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was teaching, basically telling the Prophet ﷺ, you would have to be patient with those. Let's see. And there is another hadith that was basically giving us more information. Let's see. عن خباب في قول الله عز وجل ولا تطرد الذين, in regards to this ayah, and basically in regards to this ayah right here, that الأقرع ibn Habis. Who's الأقرع ibn Habis? الأقرع ibn Habis was a Sahabi, but he was actually a very upper class Sahabi. He was like a chieftain. Him and Uyayna ibn Hisn al-Fazari, they basically came to the Prophet ﷺ and they found Suhaib, Bilal, Ammar, who's also, well, at least his mother was a slave. Okay, so in other words, he was basically considered a lower class. Khabbab, so they were basically a group of slaves or ex-slaves at least. And Al-Aqra' ibn Habis was considered a chieftain. So what happened? And Al-Aqra', why was he called Al-Aqra'? Al-Aqra' means bald, but his actual name is Firas. His actual name is Firas. But they used to call people based on sometimes their appearance, so they called him the bald one. But hey, that's, that was the name. Okay, so they were all sitting with a group of basically the lower class from the mu'mineen. When they saw the Prophet ﷺ, around them, they basically had belittled them. So they came to the Prophet ﷺ and they asked to be segregated away from them. And they said, we want to basically have a segregated, basically halaqa, and that way the different Arab would give us the honor and give us and maintain our importance, our honor. And of course, you're getting a number of different Arab coming in, and we would be really shy to be included along with these slaves. So if we would come to you, just, segregate them away. And once we're done, then you can sit with them, but we don't want to be included, or at least, write us something that would give us, a certain level, a certain social status that would segregate us away from these people. So the Prophet ﷺ attempted to write a note, and that's of course the rest of the Sahaba, they were sitting segregated, but that's when the ayah was revealed, basically in regards to this attempt. Okay, and certainly the ayah continues, وَكَذَلِكَ فَتَنَّا, here's the ayah, وَكَذَلِكَ فَتَنَّا بَعْضَهُمْ بِبَعْضٍ لِيَقُولُوا أَهَؤُلَاءِ مَنَّ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ مِنْ بَيْنِنَا أَلَيْسَ اللَّهُ بِأَعْلَمَ بِالشَّاكِرِينَ. So that's when the ayah was revealed, the ayah that follows that ayah, and that's how some were futinu. What is al-fitna? Al-fitna is a trial. The trial or the fitna starts out with a narrative, and then it continues to become a certain vision, and then it continues to become a certain hope, a certain classification, and just like we had done it in Surah Al-Hadid, remember that ayah. All right, in Surah Al-Hadid, we did it yesterday. Okay, so that's basically that fitna. Fitna starts out with a person being amused with something, then it becomes a narrative, then it becomes a vision, then it becomes a certain lifestyle, identity, etc., and goes in that way. So كذلك فتنا بعضهم ببعض they basically had this fitna they created basically from the past, that there is a certain social status, therefore they deserve a certain privilege, and based on that privilege they should be somehow anointed with a certain relationship with the Prophet ﷺ. So what was the narrative that they had created? ليقولوا أهؤلاء من الله عليهم من بيننا. What was the narrative? The narrative was for them to say, are those people actually equal to us? Are they somehow chosen before us? And these people, how do you choose these people to be better than us? How do you consider these people as more important? So that's when that ayah was basically revealed in that regards. Then the ayah basically continues, أَلَيْسَ اللَّهُ بِأَعْلَمْ بِالشَّاكِرِينَ? Doesn't the Lord Almighty know who the real ones that are thankful truly are? In other words, this is very similar to the ayah when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned, يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا, and then إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned in Surah Al-Hujurat that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, oh people, created you from tribes, nations, etc., and then says, إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. The best of you are the ones that hold the highest level of religious integrity. That's the same thing right here. In other words, that the Lord Almighty really knows who the real thankful ones. Notice that there's a special emphasis on being thankful. And he didn't say بِأَعْلَمَ بِالْمُتَّقِينَ, بِأَعْلَمَ بالصالحين, for example. He said بِأَعْلَمَ بِالشَّاكِرِينَ. What were they shakir of? So certainly they were lower in their financial status, but the ones that were lower in their financial status are usually the ones that recognize the value of things. You want to put it in context that the ones that they were referring to were basically the the poor Sahaba. And that's to let us know that reduced privileges, and we're speaking about whether reduced wealth or whether we're speaking about uh, reduced social status, etc., that produces within them. Remember how we were doing before? We said a certain feeling invokes a certain behavior, a certain action. That's the same thing. The lack of privilege, the lack of matter, the lack of wealth produced in them stronger commitment and a stronger recognition for the value of shukr. Keep that in mind. Don't give your children everything they need or everything they want. Sorry, let me edit that one. Don't give your children everything they want, because that will make and provoke in them the feeling of entitlement and not feeling the value and the value of being thankful for what they have. This is extremely important. So when the ayah said بِأَعْلَمَ بِالشَّاكِرِينَ, that's to basically say that what these Sahaba had was basically something that the privileged Sahaba did not have. That the privileged Sahaba did not have, which is being thankful, embracing the value of being basically thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what were they thankful of? They were thankful of the most important thing, that is their Islam. They were thankful of their Islam. They probably didn't have the dunya, but they were thankful of their Islam. And that's what gives them a higher privilege to be closer to the Prophet ﷺ than even those that probably had the social status being higher. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was in, that inference is that these people that you might classify as of a lower status, they're actually of a higher status because of their commitment to the value and recognition of religious integrity, of being thankful. And that's when that ayah said, وَإِذَا جَاءَكَ الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِآيَاتِنَا فَقُلْ سَلَامٌ عَلَيْكُمْ كَتَبَ رَبُّكُمْ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ الرَّحْمَةِ. If the believers would come to you and tell them, Salamun alaykum, spread peace to them, and tell them that your Lord Almighty had ordained upon himself that he would be merciful. That's when they said, we had come closer. فَدَنَوْنَا مِنْهُ حَتَّى وَضَعْنَا رُكَبَنَا على ركبته. So then we got closer and closer to the point that we had our knees right next to the Prophet ﷺ's knees. And the Prophet ﷺ would sit with us, and if anyone would want to get up and leave us, that's when basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this ayah. And what happened? وَلَا تَعْدُ عَيْنَاكَ عَنْهُمْ تُرِيدُ زِينَةَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. Don't turn your faces away or your eyes away from them, seeking زِينَةَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيا. Because you want to relate that بِأَعْلَمْ بِالشَّاكِرِينَ. Okay, so the more of dunya that they had, even though this is a different ayah, okay, the more of dunya that they had, it reduced their connection with basically that shukr, with being thankful. Okay, so that's why the ayah said, وَلَا تُطِعْ مَنْ أَغْفَلْنَا قَلْبَهُ عَنْ ذِكْرِنَا. Don't obey and listen to those whose hearts were away from the reminder of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that was talking about Uyayna and al-Aqra, both of them. وَاتَّبَعَ هَوَاهُ وَكَانَ أَمْرُهُ فُرُطًا. And they followed their hawa, and they followed their own whims. And then, of course, their matters would basically be in a different, in a furuta, meaning it would basically keep going down and down. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned, by the way, does that mean Al-Aqra' ibn Habis is not a Sahabi? No, Al-Aqra' ibn Habis, in fact, participated in the Battle of Hunayn. Al-Aqra' ibn Habis later on became one of the most important Sahaba as well. So this basically was coming in a certain context. So just keep that one in mind. So definitely appreciating and embracing the Sahaba is part of al-Iman. Remember, حب الصالحين is part of al-Iman. Why? Because of the legacy that they would carry. حب الصالحين من الإيمان. حب الصالحين من الإيمان. حب and loving al-Anbiya is part of faith. Loving basically Sahaba themselves is actually part of faith. So that's when certainly we would just relate to these ayat. Okay, let's see. So نزلت هذه الآية سعد بن وقاص, we mentioned that one. And for بالغداة والعشي, for this قراءة, there is another قراءة بالغدوة, not بالغداة, بالغدوة والعشي. It really means the same thing. الغدوة can mean tomorrow and could also mean early morning. So بالغدوة and بالغداة can mean the same thing. You could even see in this qira'ah at least that there's even a waw that is written, but it's a silent waw. So بالغدوة or بالغداة. And in both qira'ah, same thing with الكاف, بالغدوة والعشي and بالغداة والعشي. So ما عليك من حسابهم من شيء, meaning that you would not be the one to basically reward them or probably give them their provisions. The rizquhum basically is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And وَمَا مِنْ حِسَابِكَ عَلَيْهِمْ مِنْ شَيْءٍ. And if that was the case, then you would basically have to sit with them and do not repel them away, even if that might be under the pretense that basically we wanted to probably get get those that had a certain higher level of social status to come closer, that no, you want to make sure that your reasoning, your commitment, the principle is all basically coherent. It's all coherent and coming with the same basically torch, and not basically coming in with one principle and the means basically changing the principle. No, the means do not justify, or the ends do not justify the means. At the end, the principle, the beginning of the principle, the end of the principle is all going to be one. So فَتَكُونَ مِنَ الظَّالِمِينَ. Does that mean the Prophet ﷺ had become? Absolutely not. The Prophet ﷺ is infallible. But if the person is going to separate themselves away from the salihin, that might be on the lower end of the social status, that might actually put them in a position of fitna, So what should we do? Well, basically connect with the salihin, connect with those that are probably living at a high standard of faith, in order for you to basically elevate your standard of faith as well, and possibly be at a higher level of faith. This is it, inshallah. Subhanakallah bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. I know we took long, but sorry about that, everybody. And I hope, inshallah, we will continue tomorrow. Any questions before we sign off? No? I guess everybody is just tired. Okay. And what I'm going to do. Ustaz Umayya, go ahead, dear.
السلام عليكم. For أقرع بن حاسب, he looks like
Ibn Habis.
Habis, sorry.
It's okay. I know it was a slip of tongue. I know you know the right answer.
Yeah. Okay. He was looks like arrogant before he became Muslim, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. Before he had, of course, you had, just like, for example, Abu Sufyan, you had a number of different Sahaba. You had, let's say, I can think of Abdullah ibn, what was his name? Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh al-Amiri, for example. You also had Suhail ibn Amr. So you had a number of different Sahaba that didn't have the best history, because they were chieftains, they were important figures, and certainly they abused their social status. And certainly, if we don't put the context in place, we may wrong certain Sahaba. And that's why it's important to remember to differentiate between their history and between what later on their contribution to Islam was. All right?
Jazakallah khair.
وإياكم. So this is it, inshallah. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa